Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back for an edition of looking at underperforming skill players in this week's episode. Before we get into that, I want to note that this week's podcast is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. As usual, we still have a promo code ETR over Underdog Fantasy. So if you haven't deposited over there, first-time depositors will get a match to their first deposit up to $100. So take advantage of that. Use promo code at Underdog Fantasy, get in their weekly DFS Battle Royale games, and also get prepared. I'm sure we'll see an announcement on playoff best ball at some point in the near future over at Underdog Fantasy. Want to apologize for missing podcasts last week. Also won't have the Game Scores podcast this week. That should be back next week with Adam Roush. Just been a real busy time with the NBA NFL overlap. Also, this weekend, I will be racing in the half marathon in Charlotte. So if anybody's down there, come say hi. It's been a difficult training period. My training was going really well up until about 6 weeks ago. Did a 12-mile run at the pace I wanted to, but ended up hurting my hip flexor and my glute a little bit. About the same time I got sick. Was sick for like a month, took a week off of getting sick, and then my son brought something home from school. So if you have kids, just constant sickness. So it's been tough between that and busy with work. So sorry for missing some podcasts. But I'm still looking forward to racing this weekend. Not sure what my strategy will be. Initially, I wanted to beat my PR, which was just under an hour and 39 minutes. It seems like that's probably not in the cards since I still have this cold and the training's been tough while trying to get healthy at the same time the last 6 weeks with my glute and my hip flexor. But as Adam Levitan says, no excuses. Play like a champion. So I do have a race plan to at least give me some chance of going out and setting a PR. Although more than likely, I think it's going to be one that I'm just going to try to enjoy if it's not my day. But you guys don't care about that. Let's talk about fantasy football, and we'll get into the underperformers. The RB model the last couple of weeks has been kind of middling, a lot of boring names on there. The biggest hit last week, of course, was Michael Carter, which wasn't a huge surprise. The model, of course, was catching up on the recent uptick in work with Breece Hall injured. And we do see, like, even in a tough matchup, if Back has, the requisite workload, can get there with upside. He puts up 15.6 PPR points against the Bills. But all in all, not a super successful couple of weeks for the model. And do want to point out, as I've said before, I think the underperforming by Leone stuff's better for the pass catchers because the way the opportunity works and like the variance there, I think that type of model works better there. Whereas for NFL, some of these opportunities are players who are just kind of dust, and we need to see regression in efficiency. And if you've got Najee Harris, whose dust role is diminishing, Jalen Warren's going to play more, it's a problem. David Montgomery possibly dust. Khalil Herbert's cutting into that role, going to be a problem. We'll have more on David Montgomery this week, though, because I do have some optimism. But I think if you're going to take advantage of the underperformers, you really want to zone in on players who, we're pretty confident that the workload is going to continue to be there, even though they haven't performed well, and B, that they're healthy. So keep that in mind. One player who was not on the model but has been an underperformer over the course of the season, Joe Mixon, of course, with the massive game against Carolina, and he was a bit more obvious as a under the radar, or not under the radar, but underperformer player. But he definitely fit the role of, like, the health was okay. We knew that Samaje P. Ryan and Chris Evans were not cutting into that role at all, and it was only a matter of time. Whereas some of these guys who have failed, Leonard Fournette, we've seen Rashad White cut into that role. Devin Singletary, we've seen some issues with James Cook. Now they traded for Nyheim Hines. So that's been a problem. And we'll segue that into this week's list. And you see some of the same names because they continue to get kind of like okay opportunities, but they're not necessarily coming through the way that we want them to. So Devin Singletary, I know I'm kind of off. Obviously, you have the Josh Allen injury risk. We don't even know who's starting the game this week. It looks like it's trending towards being Case Keenum for Buffalo. So that's going to reduce some of the scoring expectation, although it could improve some of the goal line play calling for Singletary. That'd be the biggest plus for him. The other negatives, though, is James Cook played early last week, which is a sign that I think that, the trade for Nyheim Hines wasn't that they're out on James Cook. It was more that they wanted a guy for a specific role, and they don't necessarily want Singletary doing all this pass catching, but they still want Cook's upside in there. So now you've got two guys battling for Singletary. So he's someone too that I think the model inflates a little bit because the team total is one of the factors that we use. And generally running backs with high team totals, you can perform better than Singletary has, where all his touches have come from. But Buffalo's somewhat unique in terms of where the high value touches come from, and operates a little bit differently than high scoring offenses generally do. It's not as favorable to running backs, despite how many points they put up on the board. KC is also similar. We saw Clyde Edwards-Helaire on here at varying degrees of success to start the year. Fournette, even with Rachaad White cutting in, I do think it's a good time to take advantage of him. I expect him to remain the lead there. I do still think the high value touches for Fournette will be strong if this offense can rebound. It's a big if, but I do think they will ultimately rebound and be a bit better. And that starts this week against Seattle, of course, the Island morning game. And then the other guy I want to mention, James Conner, immediately comes back and kind of takes over the high value touches for the Cardinals. Was somewhat uncertain if it was going to be how much, Benjamin would persist there after playing, fairly well in James Conner's absence and showing a little bit more upside. But this team clearly prefers James Conner. He's going to catch passes. He's going to score touchdowns, kind of like a mini Fournette to a degree, where, high value touches should be there, even if the efficiency isn't there. Not the best spot in the world this week, but I do think Conner is kind of a forgotten man and could surprise down the stretch with some high-end fantasy performances. Okay, let's cut over to the pass catchers, where there was a lot more success that was missed the last 2 weeks. Particularly week 8 was just like an absolute banner week for the by Leone. We've been hitting on AJ Brown as someone who he's going to be fine almost every week. And there's going to be a week where he goes nuts. And we knew it was coming. It finally came. He gets to a 3 touchdown game, puts up nearly 40 PPR points. We also had some good performances in week 8 from Garrett Wilson, Kyle Pitts, Romeo Doubs, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Mike Evans, Zach Ertz. I mean, it was just like a real hit there. Some guys in particular to talk about, though, with week 8 and 9. Garrett Wilson is someone that on this show going into week 8, I said I didn't really trust, even though he was on here, and also just noted how low the bar was. His last 3 fantasy points per game heading into week 8 was 4.6, but he puts up 17.5 in week 8, and then also, came off the model, but had a really strong week 9. And it just goes to show you sometimes having the objective model is better than all the subjectivity that we try to put into things. And Garrett Wilson has managed to have that success with Zach Wilson, even though it wasn't there for a few weeks. And then also Zach Ertz just on this model like all the time, but his role is insane. I think he'll always be an underperformer because his yards per target and his efficiency is unlikely to come up as bad as it is. But I think he'll always he's like top 5 tight end because the role's so good. I actually have him. If you combine wide receivers and tight ends, he has a top 10 expected fantasy points on the entire season. That's how good his role has been. So he's getting a lot of balls that he's just going to have weeks like where he goes 5 for 40, gets you 9 PPR points, which isn't so bad at tight end. So many red zone looks, though, too. And that's kind of what we saw. It's basically if he scores a touchdown, he's overperforming. If he doesn't, he's underperforming by a little bit. That's a pretty good dynamic, even if he's not going to have a huge ceiling. So that's someone I was definitely wrong on prior to the offseason, where I focused a little bit more on the skill side of things. And right now, the opportunity is winning out from a fantasy perspective over the skill. Even though he's been bad, he's been good for fantasy, which was sort of the people who were pro Zach Ertz were correct on that side of the ledger mattering a little bit more. Let's go to the list for this week. And there's some names I want to mention here. Kyle Pitts, who's been up and down. He was that big hit for us in week 8, put us up 19 PPR points, and then only puts up like 4 last week. In total, he's only averaging 9.2 over his last 3 fantasy points per game. Both the by Leone and our weekly projection for him are in the double digits. And with Pitts, It's going to be volatile, but it's worth noting this guy has 649 air yards, second most of the tight end position. Now, his expected fantasy points aren't nearly as high as Mark Andrews, who he's pretty close to in expected fantasy points. One, because the team total hasn't been the same. Two, the total targets aren't there. And as much as we like air yards, just catching the ball and raw volume of targets, sometimes in some models that are purely looking at air yards, it gets lost in just how valuable racking up catches is. Again, Zach Ertz kind of fits that role. And red zone opportunities. Everyone who's above him, I think he's only like 8th among tight ends in expected fantasy points, despite having that air yards total that's an outlier at the position. And again, the total volume and the red zone volume in particular just hasn't been there. I've only got him with 5 red zone looks on the year. Now, I am not including penalties, and I know he's had like 2 or 3 callbacks from penalties, so it hasn't been quite that bad, but that's the explanation. Still, week 9 last week, 208 air yards. It's just absurd. It gives you a ceiling at the tight end position you don't have for other guys. My position on Pitts is, yes, he's a disappointment. I thought he was overdrafted at the time. Definitely looks overdrafted now, but he's still like a T6 to me, where like you're going to have the really bad weeks like last week, but at least you've got the ceiling for a week like 2 weeks ago. Game environment tonight against the Carolina Panthers doesn't look great. We got some weather going on. It could be a little bit of a run fest. So even if it doesn't happen this week, you're gonna have your spike weeks for Kyle Pitts, and he's run a little bit bad to start the year, even after accounting for the unfortunate play calling from Arthur Smith. The other guy I want to hit on, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, he has been somewhat disappointing between leaving the game early with injury a couple of times, and he came back and he hasn't been that great. And then last week after the Hawkinson trade, he was really chalky and didn't perform well, had a bad efficiency game. It was also a game with a weird game script where, Aaron Rodgers led some long drives and then threw interceptions at the goal line, which, took plays run away from Detroit while simultaneously keeping Detroit in a positive game script. So it wasn't the most ideal spot for him as a pass catcher. Again, combination weird game script, and then just didn't play that well. But 34.6% target share. Amon-Ra St. Brown is, doesn't have, he's kind of like the AJ Brown thing I talked about. Like, he's going to be fine almost every week, and he's going to have some absolutely nuclear weeks. So definitely go back to the Amon-Ra St. Brown. Well, Devonta Smith on the list for this week, and that Philly situation in general is going to be volatile. They're going to be really good, but because they're really good, you might not have enough total bulk volume for all 3 of the primary pass catchers to get there in a given week. Sometimes it's only going to be one guy, and I would just fade the recency bias. We're going to see, we saw Devonta Smith, I think it was week 3, just go nuclear at like low ownership. We're going to see another week where he goes nuclear. People are going to be focused on AJ Brown after the week 8 performance, Dallas Goedert after the week 9 performance. Really smart time to go after Devonta Smith with the market. You'll probably phasing him out a little bit. Final 3 guys I want to mention, but we have 3 Pittsburgh Steelers on the list. Now, the Steelers, they just flood all these lists because they're a concentrated offense that sucks. So we get Najee Harris on the by Leone at running back. We get all the pass catchers here for Pittsburgh. There's actually 4 Pittsburgh pass catchers if you want to count Chase Claypool, who's moved over to Chicago, but some of the Pittsburgh data influencing that. I do think it's a good spot to target uncertainty. And I will include Claypool in that. I think for Pickens, Freiermuth, and Deontay Johnson, you lose Claypool. I don't know if their roles change a ton, but they might change enough. And if they're just a little bit better than they've been, which, maybe they won't be, they do kind of stink, but if they're a little bit better and you have a little bit more concentration, could mean really good things for Pickens, Freiermuth, and Deontay Johnson. I know a couple of these guys on my list also line up with the rest of the season top 150 show that the guys just did. Mark Dinkenbrink, Adam Levitan, and Jack Miller. I think Jack Miller's buy of the week transaction to make was to get Amon-Ra St. Brown, and for Mark Dinkenbrink, it was Pat Freiermuth. Now, looking at the Chase Claypool side of things, it seems like a bad move from Pittsburgh to Chicago given the lack of pass attempts, but I think when you're in a spot with Claypool where he was meh, he was seeing volume, but he wasn't really startable because of lack of upside, you'll kind of take that reduction in median expectation for a hint of upside. Like, what if it gets a little bit better? So I'm interested to see what he does in a good matchup against Detroit this week. And that reminds me, Montgomery, I meant to talk about Montgomery a little bit more because he's also on the running back list this week. I actually think he's been getting the first 2 drives no matter what. So even though he's splitting with Khalil Herbert, it's like a hot hand thing. And Montgomery is at least solidified getting the first couple of drives. So in a really good matchup where they could be extremely run heavy, they're usually run heavy. I actually am into Montgomery this week, despite him also sort of representing some of the flaws of the running back underperformer model from a macro concept. So that's it for this week. Hope everybody has a really successful week 10. And next week, I'll hopefully be back with this version of the Establish the Edge podcast episode, as well as the Game Scores podcast with Adam Roush. So appreciate everyone taking the time to tune in.